In 1968, biologist Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb, a book predicting catastrophic famine in the 1970s and 1980s that would kill hundreds of millions of people, particularly in Asia. Ehrlich wrote with apocalyptic certainty, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now." He declared that India could not possibly feed its population and that mass starvation was inevitable. The book became a bestseller, terrifying readers worldwide and confirming what many intellectuals believed, that overpopulation would lead to collapse. 1 year later, in 1969, Norman Borlaug stood in a wheat field in Punjab, India, watching farmers harvest a crop that yielded 3 times more grain per acre than any wheat grown there before. India was on track to become self-sufficient in wheat production. Ehrlich's predictions were already being proven catastrophically wrong. In 1970, Borlaug received the Nobel Peace Prize for preventing the famine Ehrlich had declared inevitable. Norman Ernest Borlaug was born on March 25, 1914, on a small farm near Cresco, Iowa, the oldest of 4 children born to Norwegian immigrant farmers. The farm was 100 acres of marginal land, and the family struggled. Norman attended a one-room schoolhouse and worked the farm, before and after school, learning the rhythms of planting, harvest, and the constant vulnerability to weather, disease, and market prices. He graduated high school in 1932, during the Great Depression, when farmland was worthless and jobs non-existent. His grandfather urged him to continue his education, saying, "You're wiser to fill your head now if you want to fill your belly later." Borlaug enrolled at the University of Minnesota on a scholarship, studying forestry because it offered practical job prospects. During his undergraduate years, Borlaug experienced hunger personally. He had little money for food and often ate only oatmeal and apples. One morning in 1933, waiting in a bread line in Minneapolis, he saw unemployed men standing in the cold, desperate for a free meal. The memory haunted him. He later said, "I saw how food was used as a weapon. I saw people lined up for bread. I understood then that hunger is the ultimate indignity." The Depression shaped Borlaug's worldview. He believed that productive agriculture was the foundation of civilization, that hunger destroyed dignity and hope, and that science could provide solutions if applied with discipline and urgency. After graduating in 1937 with a degree in forestry, Borlaug continued at Minnesota, earning a master's degree in plant pathology in 1939 and a PhD in 1942, studying plant diseases and genetics. In 1944, at age 30, Borlaug joined the Rockefeller Foundation's Cooperative Mexican Agricultural Program, working as a plant pathologist and geneticist. Mexico was importing half its wheat to feed its population, and the country's agricultural productivity was among the lowest in the world. Mexican wheat farmers averaged 8 bushels per acre, compared to 28 in the United States. Yields were suppressed by stem rust, a fungal disease that destroyed crops, and by traditional varieties that were poorly suited to Mexican conditions. Borlaug was assigned to develop rust-resistant wheat varieties that could thrive in Mexico's diverse climates. He established research stations in different regions, crossbreeding wheat varieties, testing for disease resistance, and selecting the best performers. The work was tedious, repetitive, and slow. Progress was measured in increments over years. Borlaug's breakthrough came from observing Japanese wheat. After World War II, researchers brought to the United States a semi-dwarf wheat variety called Norin 10, developed in Japan. Traditional wheat grew on tall stalks, sometimes 5 feet high, which made the plants vulnerable to lodging, falling over when the grain head became heavy or wines blew. Lodging destroyed crops. Semi-dwarf wheat, standing only 2 feet tall, had thick, sturdy stems that could support heavy grain heads without falling. Borlaug realized that if he crossed semi-dwarf varieties with high-yielding, disease-resistant strains, he could create wheat that produced far more grain per acre than traditional varieties. The challenge was that semi-dwarf genes came with fertility problems and poor yields. Borlaug spent years breeding, testing, and selecting, gradually incorporating dwarf genes into high-yielding backgrounds. By the mid-1950s, Borlaug had developed semi-dwarf wheat varieties that combined short stature, disease resistance, and high yields. The varieties responded dramatically to irrigation and fertilizers, producing grain heads so heavy that traditional tall wheat would have collapsed. Borlaug's wheat could yield 3 or 4 times more grain per acre than traditional varieties under optimal conditions. But there was a problem. The varieties were photoperiod sensitive, meaning they only grew during specific day lengths. This limited where they could be planted. Borlaug needed varieties that could grow anywhere, regardless of latitude or season. To solve this, he pioneered shuttle breeding, planting 1 generation in Sonora, northern Mexico, during winter, then immediately planting the seeds in Toluca, central Mexico, at high altitude, during summer. This produced 2 generations per year instead of one, accelerating the breeding process. It also selected for photoperiod insensitivity, because only plants that could grow in both locations survived. By 1963, 95% of Mexico's wheat was planted with Borlaug's semi-dwarf varieties. Mexico's wheat production had increased sixfold since 1944, and the country, which had been importing wheat for decades, became a net exporter. Borlaug's success in Mexico attracted attention from other countries facing food shortages. In 1961, India's government invited Borlaug to visit and assess whether his wheat varieties could be adapted to Indian conditions. India was struggling with chronic food shortages, and population growth was outpacing agricultural production. Borlaug traveled to India and saw conditions far worse than anything he had encountered in Mexico. He believed his varieties could work if Indian farmers adopted modern agricultural practices, irrigation, fertilizers, and disease control. But implementing the Green Revolution in India and Pakistan proved far more difficult than in Mexico. Indian agricultural scientists were skeptical of foreign expertise, particularly from an American. They argued that Borlaug's varieties were unsuitable for Indian soils, climates, and farming traditions. Bureaucrats worried that increased wheat production would disrupt rice markets and cause political problems. Some politicians saw Borlaug's program as neocolonialism, Western nations imposing their methods on developing countries. Environmental activists warned that chemical fertilizers would poison the land and water. Cultural traditionalists objected to abandoning indigenous crop varieties for foreign seeds. Borlaug faced resistance from every direction. He responded by demonstrating results. He planted small test plots, invited skeptics to inspect them, and let the yields speak for themselves. In 1965, famine threatened both India and Pakistan. Drought, population growth, and war created conditions for catastrophe. The United States shipped 1/5 of its wheat production to India to prevent mass starvation, but the aid was a temporary solution. India needed to produce more food domestically. Borlaug convinced Indian and Pakistani officials to import large quantities of his semi-dwarf seed varieties for immediate planting. In early 1965, Borlaug arranged for 550 tons of seed to be shipped from Mexico to India and Pakistan. 250 tons to Pakistan, 200 to India, with the remainder held as reserves. The shipment encountered every possible obstacle, demonstrating the chaos and fragility of the undertaking. The seed shipment left Mexico in spring 1965, loaded onto 35 trucks for transport to Los Angeles. Mexican police stopped the convoy, suspicious of the cargo. U.S. customs agents at the border initially refused entry, citing regulations against importing foreign seeds. After delays and negotiations, the convoy entered California, only to be stopped again when the National Guard closed freeways due to the Watts riots in Los Angeles. When the seeds finally reached the port, they were loaded onto a freighter bound for Bombay and Karachi. 12 hours after the ship sailed, war broke out between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. Borlaug received a telegram from Pakistan's agriculture minister. "Bombs are falling on my front lawn. Be patient, the money is in the bank." The shipment arrived eventually, but planting was delayed by weeks, missing the optimal growing season. Borlaug and his team, including Indian and Pakistani scientists he had trained in Mexico, planted the first crops of semi-dwarf wheat on the subcontinent in late 1965, sometimes working within sight of artillery fire. The war created additional complications. Travel between India and Pakistan was impossible, communications were disrupted, and agricultural programs were considered low priorities during military conflict. Yet the wheat grew. Despite late planting and poor germination, yields increased 70% compared to traditional varieties. The harvest prevented general wartime starvation, though localized famine still occurred. More importantly, the demonstration convinced skeptical officials that Borlaug's methods worked. In 1966 and 1967, India and Pakistan imported thousands of tons of seed and began large-scale planting. The results were dramatic. Pakistan's wheat production increased from 3.4 million tons in 1965 to 8.4 million tons by 1970. India's wheat production grew from 11 million tons to 20 million tons in the same period. By 1974, India was producing 60 million tons annually, more than enough to feed its population. The country that Ehrlich had declared incapable of feeding itself had become self-sufficient in wheat production. Similar transformations occurred in other countries. Turkey, Afghanistan, Tunisia, Morocco, and later China adopted Borlaug's varieties and methods. Global wheat production increased dramatically, and the predicted famines never materialized. The success was so unprecedented that journalists coined the term Green Revolution to describe it. Borlaug became known as the father of the Green Revolution. In October 1970, Borlaug was working in a wheat field in Toluca, Mexico, when he received word that he had won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was only the third agricultural scientist to receive the prize, and the citation emphasized his contribution to world peace through increasing food supply. The Norwegian Nobel Committee stated, "More than any other single person of this age, he has helped provide bread for a hungry world. We have made this choice in the hope that providing bread will also give the world peace." Borlaug's Nobel lecture emphasized that the Green Revolution had bought time, not solved the underlying problem of population growth. He said, "The Green Revolution has won a temporary success in man's war against hunger and deprivation. It has given man a breathing space." Despite the Nobel Prize and widespread recognition among agricultural scientists, Borlaug faced increasing criticism from environmentalists and activists who opposed the Green Revolution's methods. Critics argued that high-yield agriculture depended on chemical fertilizers and pesticides that damaged ecosystems, polluted water, and harmed human health. They claimed that monoculture farming destroyed biodiversity and made crops vulnerable to pests and diseases. They accused Borlaug of promoting corporate agriculture that enriched multinational chemical companies while impoverishing small farmers who couldn't afford expensive inputs. Some critics went further, arguing that increasing food production was counterproductive because it enabled population growth, exacerbating long-term sustainability problems. Borlaug responded to these criticisms with characteristic bluntness. He argued that opposing fertilizers and modern agriculture was a luxury of the well-fed. He said, "Some of the environmental lobbyists of the Western nations are the salt of the earth, but many of them are elitists. They've never experienced the physical sensation of hunger. They do their lobbying from comfortable office suites in Washington or Brussels. If they lived just 1 month amid the misery of the developing world, as I have for 50 years, they'd be crying out for tractors and fertilizer and irrigation canals and be outraged that fashionable elitists back home were trying to deny them these things." Borlaug pointed out that without high-yield agriculture, feeding the world's growing population would require clearing millions of additional acres of forest and wilderness for farmland, causing far greater environmental damage than fertilizer use. The debate over the Green Revolution's environmental impact continues, but the human impact is undeniable. Estimates suggest that Borlaug's wheat varieties and the agricultural practices associated with them saved over 1 billion lives by preventing famines that would have occurred had crop yields remained at 1960s levels. The figure comes from Greg Easterbrook's 1997 article, "Forgotten Benefactor of Humanity," which calculated that the form of agriculture Borlaug promoted prevented 1 billion deaths. Dennis Avery, director of the Center for Global Food Issues, reached similar estimates. In 2009, Josette Sheeran, executive director of the World Food Program, stated that Borlaug saved more lives than any man in human history. The number is not hyperbole. It is based on comparing actual food production with projected population growth and starvation rates had yields remained static. Borlaug's contributions extended beyond wheat. His methods and philosophy influenced rice breeding programs in the Philippines, where scientists at the International Rice Research Institute developed semi-dwarf rice varieties using similar principles. High-yield rice transformed agriculture across Southeast Asia, increasing food security in countries including the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. The combined impact of improved wheat and rice varieties enabled global food production to keep pace with population growth, which doubled from 3 billion in 1960 to over 6 billion by 2000. Ehrlich had predicted mass starvation as populations grew. Instead, per capita food availability increased, malnutrition rates declined, and famines became rarer. Yet Borlaug never claimed to have solved world hunger. He repeatedly emphasized that the Green Revolution was a temporary reprieve, buying time for societies to address underlying issues of poverty, inequality, and sustainable development. He warned that continued population growth would eventually overwhelm agricultural capacity if fertility rates didn't decline. He advocated for education, women's rights, and economic development as essential complements to increased food production. He understood that hunger was not solely a production problem, but also involved distribution, politics, and economics. Increasing yields was necessary but not sufficient. Farmers needed markets, infrastructure, and stable governments to translate production into prosperity. In the 1980s and 1990s, Borlaug turned his attention to Africa, where food insecurity remained widespread despite the Green Revolution's success elsewhere. African agriculture faced unique challenges: poor soils, unreliable rainfall, limited infrastructure, and political instability. Borlaug established the Sasakawa Global 2000 program, working with African farmers to demonstrate that improved seeds, fertilizers, and management practices could increase yields dramatically. The program achieved success in several countries, including Ethiopia, Ghana, and Nigeria, but scaling up proved difficult. African governments were often reluctant to invest in agriculture. Donors prioritized other development goals, and environmental activists opposed the use of fertilizers and improved seeds, arguing that traditional farming methods were more sustainable and culturally appropriate. Borlaug found these arguments infuriating. He pointed out that slash-and-burn agriculture, romanticized by some activists as indigenous and sustainable, was destroying African forests and wildlife habitat far more destructively than modern farming. He noted that fertilizer use in Africa was so low that application rates could increase for decades before causing the environmental problems seen in developed countries. He argued that opposing modern agriculture in Africa was condemning millions to hunger and poverty based on ideological preferences of Western environmentalists who had never experienced food insecurity. His bluntness made enemies, but Borlaug never softened his message. He believed that preventing hunger was a moral imperative that outweighed other considerations. Borlaug's personal life was marked by relentless work and sacrifice. He married Margaret Gibson in 1937, and they had 3 children. Margaret supported his work but endured long separations when Borlaug was traveling or stationed in Mexico for months at a time. Colleagues described Borlaug as tireless, often working 18-hour days in the field, testing thousands of wheat varieties and refusing to retire even in his 80s. He continued consulting, traveling to Africa and Asia, and advocating for agricultural research until shortly before his death. He received numerous honors, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1977 and the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007, making him one of only 7 people to receive the Nobel Prize, Presidential Medal, and Congressional Gold Medal. Borlaug died on September 12, 2009 in Dallas, Texas, at age 95. Obituaries praised his contributions, calling him one of the most important figures of the 20th century. Yet even in death, he remained less famous than many far less consequential figures. The general public knew little about the man who had saved 1 billion lives. His story was not taught in schools, his achievements were not celebrated in popular culture, and his name was largely forgotten outside agricultural circles. The invisibility of Borlaug's legacy reflects a broader pattern. Successes that prevent disasters are less celebrated than dramatic interventions. Vaccines that prevent disease are less famous than cures. Engineers who design safe structures are less celebrated than rescuers who pull survivors from collapsed buildings. And agronomists who prevent famine are less famous than aid workers who distribute food during emergencies. The environmental criticisms of the Green Revolution, while overstated by activists, are not entirely without merit. High-yield agriculture does require more fertilizers, which can cause water pollution if overused. Monoculture farming does reduce biodiversity and can make crops more vulnerable to pests and diseases. The reliance on irrigation has depleted aquifers in some regions, creating long-term sustainability concerns. And the economic structure of modern agriculture has displaced some traditional farming communities, creating social disruption. Borlaug acknowledged these problems but argued that the alternative, allowing millions to starve while preserving traditional farming methods, was morally indefensible. He believed that addressing environmental concerns required improving agricultural practices, not abandoning high-yield farming. Borlaug's wheat varieties revolutionized agriculture, but they were not perfect. The semi-dwarf varieties require adequate water and nutrients to achieve high yields. In regions with poor soils and limited rainfall, the varieties perform less well. This has led to criticisms that the Green Revolution primarily benefited farmers in favorable environments while bypassing the poorest regions. Borlaug spent decades trying to extend the Green Revolution to Africa, but progress has been slower than in Asia, yet even incomplete success represents enormous progress. The Green Revolution was never intended to solve all agricultural problems everywhere. It was designed to increase food production enough to prevent mass starvation, and by that measure, it succeeded spectacularly. The contrast between Ehrlich's predictions and Borlaug's achievements is instructive. Ehrlich extrapolated trends linearly, assuming that agricultural productivity would remain static while populations grew exponentially. He dismissed technological solutions as impossible and predicted catastrophe with apocalyptic certainty. Borlaug, working in the field, understood that agricultural productivity was not fixed, but could be improved dramatically through scientific breeding, better management, and appropriate inputs. He believed that human ingenuity could overcome Malthusian limits, and he dedicated his life to proving it. Ehrlich wrote, "Books predicting doom. Borlaug bred wheat that prevented it. History vindicated Borlaug, but Ehrlich's pessimism continues to influence environmental discourse decades after his predictions failed." Borlaug's story fits the pattern seen throughout history. Watson Watt's radar was dismissed until it saved Britain. Mitchell's Spitfire was mocked until it defended the skies. Brunel's ships were called extravagant until they connected continents. Harrison's chronometer was rejected until it solved navigation. Semmelweis's hand-washing was ridiculed until it saved mothers. The Wright brothers were ignored until their planes changed warfare. Holt's tractors were dismissed until they became tanks. Higgins' boats were opposed until they enabled D-Day. Stillard's chain reaction was called moonshine until it unlocked the atom. Goddard's rockets were mocked until they reached the moon. Hillman's vaccines broke rules until they saved millions. And Borlaug's wheat was accused of destroying nature until it saved 1 billion people from starvation. In each case, the innovator faced resistance, skepticism, and hostility. In each case, the innovation proved essential. And in each case, the opposition was forgotten while the achievement endured. Norman Borlaug never sought fame. He wanted to feed people. His wheat varieties, developed through decades of painstaking crossbreeding and selection, transformed global agriculture and prevented the famines that pessimists declared inevitable. Critics accused him of environmental destruction, but the alternative, allowing hunger to continue, was unacceptable to Borlaug. He believed that feeding people was the first priority, and that environmental concerns could be addressed through improved practices, not by opposing agricultural progress. His legacy is measured not in awards or accolades, but in the billion people who lived because his wheat grew where traditional varieties failed. The man who saved more lives than anyone in history remained largely unknown to those he saved. But the wheat grows, the harvests arrive, and the famines that Ehrlich predicted never came. Borlaug's quiet revolution changed the world.